That's okay. Thanks, Barry. So our first question is specifically for David. Why does PG&E require a non-disclosure agreement or an NDA to access data, identifying areas that are the best candidates for electrification?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we comply with all privacy and data aggregation laws when we develop a tool like this and when we share it. And there are legal challenges associated with providing personally identifiable information for customers, which is really the granularity at which the tool operates internally. So when we share some of that data with local governments, we require a non-disclosure agreement to ensure that we're complying with the law.
And Ivana, we do not have an in-person question yet, so why don't you go ahead and ask your next question, or the next question from our online audience.
That's great. Thank you. This question is for Veronika. How is Half Moon Bay planning on enforcing end of flow in all existing buildings by 2045?
Sure. So this is something that we're still figuring out. We have, 20 some years to figure this out. I would hope that PG&E can help us with this, since they're the ones who are providing the gas service, and ideally the gas lines would be decommissioned at that time. So we will really be developing more of what that looks like the closer we get to 2045.
All right, and we have an in-person question. Why don't you introduce yourself, Magda, and lay it on us.
Magda Szymańska, Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. I have a question to both Beckie and David. Who is the customer who can stop the electrification project? You mentioned that all customer has to agree to full electrification. And as we are running multifamily projects or in multifamily buildings, a lot of our tenants have cooking stuff operating on gas, but they are master metered, yes? So we, as a company, we own the PG&E gas account. So in this case, we, the owner of the account, is the customer who has to agree to electrification, or even one of our tenants who wants keep the gas stuff. All of our tenants has to agree, or only the owner of the gas account. Thank you.
I would have to get a lawyer to look at the contracts to be 100% sure, but I think, we typically deal with the person who's the owner of the account, not the tenant. So if your association owned the entire building and had a plan to work with their residents to electrify the entire building, I don't see why we wouldn't be able to support that. We did produce last year, we published it early this year, an electrification guidebook, which you can find on our website. I find this fairly user-friendly, and it talks through a lot of the issues that you would encounter doing a building electrification project, including how you would engage with PG&E on actually decommissioning gas lines, decommissioning the connections to your building. So I don't see why we would be dealing directly with the tenants in that case.
I was intentionally letting David take that one first. I think the only thing that I would add to that is I have interacted with some affordable housing developers who have preemptively switched out cooking technology for their buildings over to induction. And there are so many benefits associated with induction. I could go on all day. One thing I will point out, though, is that it can require a need to transition cookware. So that would just be something I would keep in mind if you're making that decision on behalf of your building occupants, to consider providing some form of resources so that they can also have cooking pans that are compatible.
Why don't we take another online question?
Great. Let's see. I had a question about, there are a bunch coming in here. One One person, Owen, is interested in how to resolve the moral hazard that the fewer people remain on a branch of the gas system, the more money those people can demand to electrify their homes or businesses. I would love to hear ideas for incentives or encouragements we can offer those people other than additional money, or whether we can get around the problem by only electrifying neighborhoods if everyone agrees and signs a contract up front, or other approaches. So this might be a question for both David and Beckie.
Sure, I can try to speak to a little of that. I think David probably has better insight into avoided costs and how those can be distributed to end use customers. But I will say that something we're really interested in, we're waiting on a decision from the Public Utilities Commission regarding tariffed on-bill financing. This is a concept which would enable utility investment in a customer home, and for that investment to be recovered over an amortized schedule on the customer's bill. Best practice designs really involve a share of splitting the customer savings and the customer obligation to pay. I think that's an interesting tactic that does not necessarily involve incentives. It could be a way to justify the utility fronting the cash to make those upgrades happen and to recover them slowly over time. So that would be one idea.
Why don't we go to an in-person question?
Hi, this is Susan Wright from the County of San Mateo. It's a question for Beckie. I was just noting you mentioned that installing heat pump HVAC in 70% of California's low and moderate income housing could cost $32 billion. Was that the incremental cost of electrifying? Sometimes I notice these statistics are suggesting that they never would have had to do any replacement on their HVAC at all. So I'm wondering if it includes incremental, and also does it take into account the IRA incentives or tech or anything like that? Thanks.
Hey, Susan. That is actually the absolute cost. It's not an incremental cost. It's a simple analysis looking at around a $10,000 cost per project, I believe. The report should be coming out in a few weeks and will include some of the background information that was the basis of that figure. So it's really meant to exemplify the scale of investment necessary. Obviously, we do know that the IRA, the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program, the tech program, local incentives can help bring down that cost significantly. The point is, though, even with all that, there's still a pretty hefty price tag associated to funding the transition, and we need to be real about investing in that.
Thank you, Beckie.
Back to you, Ivana.
Okay. There are a few themes emerging here. One is one person, or a few people actually, are asking our panelists to elaborate a little bit more on ideas around addressing the disproportionate effect that gas line decommissioning might have on lower income people. And even with incentives, the burden might be excessive. So how is this transition, maybe our panelists could elaborate a little bit more on how this transition, ideas on how this transition might be handled.
Well, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but one thing I do want to say is I do really think that zonal decarbonization actually creates an opportunity to make those investments in those equity customers as reasonable as possible to ease that burden. We want to make sure that customers who are least able to electrify on their own are at the front of the line when it comes to these decarbonization projects, so that they don't get hit with high gas rates in the future. So focusing on those customers first and foremost is part of an equity-based strategy. I would also argue that when you're doing that zonal decarbonization along with a gas decommissioning project, in theory, the avoided costs that would have gone towards the repair and replacement of that pipeline theoretically can be available as an investment in those customers' homes, helping to bring down the out-of-pocket requirement. And then the final piece here is that as the CPUC has proposed, there's an opportunity to really focus program investment in those areas where we know those gas decommissioning projects may occur. direct install programs, for example, through the Energy Savings Assistance Program or the forthcoming Equitable Building Decarbonization Program that the CEC will be administering, can really help zero cost improvements in some of these customer projects as well. So I think zonal decarbonization has the greatest possible pathway for driving investment into these disadvantaged community zones. The CPUC has also really taken strides in the affordability through electric rate reform for those customers as well. PG&E themselves has just launched a new rate that really should be favorable for customers who are on at least 2 qualifying technologies for all electric buildings. So I actually think zonal is one of the best pathways to support a more equitable transition.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Beckie just said. The other thing I would add is I expect that as building electrification becomes more commonplace, especially with things like the recent rule by the air district, I expect kind of economies of scale in the industry overall to adapt to all electric and it become easier and less expensive over time. I think the equipment costs will come down. I think the install costs will at least be comparable with gas as contractors get more experience installing things like heat pumps.
I will add something that is not necessarily related to gas, but I think is related to the process. I think we have opportunities to also, with these disadvantaged communities, leverage other incentives to make their homes healthier overall. A lot of discussion about gas appliances has to do with the health and safety of our constituents. And I think a lot of people find that to be disingenuous. And I think that there's an opportunity here to look at energy efficiency, insulation, mold abatement, lead, asbestos, all of that, and taking some of those programs and applying them while they're already doing work in the home.
Hey, look.
Hi, everyone. Aleka Seville with Collective Strategies Consulting. I really appreciate all the presentations today, and I'm curious, I kind of have a question for all of you. I really appreciated, Veronika, all your notes on how, in order to meet your goals, Half Moon Bay has to collaborate with a lot of different entities. We have a few different entities represented here, and we've talked a lot about zonal electrification. So I'm just curious, can all of you kind of give us an idea of how that actually works on the ground? What do you need from cities? What do we need from IOUs? What do we need from CCAs? What would be the practical steps to actually get some of this done? I'm assuming that the benefits that were up on your slide, Beckie, are pretty much assumed at this point because we don't have a lot of examples. But I'm just curious how you all think that should work as part of this larger plan that you've all alluded to as well. Thanks.
I can start. So I know, Half Moon Bay, we're a pretty small city. And I think the reason we went down this process is just out of necessity, looking at the climate goals. We didn't really have a choice here. So we needed to really start looking, how do we achieve this? We don't have a lot of funding, but we do have a lot of other cities and areas that are looking to achieve similar goals. So just, working together, each one of us can provide something different, right? The BayREN provides incentives. How can we make sure that those incentives are actually working for our constituents? I did a personal electrification project. I went into the switches on and called all of those contractors, ended up finding a project that was more cost effective without any incentives. And I know that that's the case with a lot of other people who are extremely motivated to do this work. And if I can't do it and I'm very motivated and I know I can call people up personally and ask them questions, it's not working for everybody else. So making sure that we're going through this, sharing our experiences, having opportunities to collaborate like this, and finding opportunities, hey, I have a little funding, you have a little funding, maybe let's do this project together, maybe sharing staff. I think there's a lot of work. I know with the San Mateo County Office of Sustainability, they're doing a lot of work talking with all the cities about this. Same thing with our Peninsula Clean Energy, our CCA. I think looking at this at a county, regional, and honestly even statewide level is going to be the best way to move forward, and that's what makes sense to the constituents as well. It doesn't make sense for Half Moon Bay to do this alone.
David, do you have a utility perspective on what communities could do?
I think Claire Hallbrook is likely to talk a little about this after break because we've been collaborating with her and others on a CEC project looking at tactical decommissioning of the gas system. And in that work, we've been talking a lot about community-based organizations and the type of efforts they would need to put in order to make these projects a reality. Our current experience is, as I mentioned, fairly small scale. It requires a tremendous amount of reaching out to customers and hand-holding along the process. We currently purchase all of the appliances for customers and manage the install. We are going to have to evolve that model if we're going to do that at scale, because it's not going to work in that way. So I think we're looking for a lot of support from local governments, from community-based organizations, things like that, to help with that customer engagement, which is, I think, the largest time resource requirement.
And Beckie, you've worn a lot of hats recently. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I worked at East Bay Community Energy on the project with David and Claire. So a bit of an echo chamber here, but we did have some very important lessons learned. And I just really want to emphasize the need for really thoughtful, long-term community engagement, especially if we're really focusing in on those disadvantaged and equity communities. That engagement, the first conversation with those customers can't be when you're asking to disconnect their gas service. There has to be a long lead time associated with communicating the benefits, getting folks excited about all electric buildings. One of the things that really was an outcome for me from the engagement on that project, these communities move at the speed of trust. This is one of my favorite quotes that I encountered in the work I did here. And they really can't, your engagement with those communities can't be driven by a specific project timeline. I think ideally the state of California will find some pot of funding to have these long-term relationships with community-based organizations, because it's of the benefit, not just for these zonal decarbonization projects, but in so much of the work we do. So I really do want to emphasize that need for those really strong CBO relationships for outreach, and emphasize what David said about the need for the city to be a partner. I mean, the utility, the CCA, these kinds of projects touch so many stakeholders that it really does need to be a collaborative approach.
So we have a few questions. We've gotten questions for David, and there's some interest in understanding some of the limitations around financing for PG&E. So one question is, how will the capital cost of electrification be funded, and what does the capital cost cover? And a related question is, what restrictions exist in terms of not being able to capitalize certain costs? So a little bit more detail around what your limitations are and what's possible in terms of capital costs.
Thanks for the question. Can you hear me? Okay, good. As it currently stands, by accounting practice and PUC guidance, we're not able to use capital dollars for behind the meter electrification expenses. So it's a PUC/accounting rule. And the result of that is that we have to, using expense dollars is a challenging situation for us because we have an overall budget envelope, and when we use expense dollars, it takes out dollar for dollar from our budget for the year. So we're unable to do a lot of those projects without hindering our capital deployment for other infrastructure needs on the system related to safety and reliability. So we're trying to balance that, and we can't spend an unlimited amount of expense dollars on electrification without hindering our ability to do the work to maintain the system. That's the primary challenge. We think shifting that paradigm so that we would be able to capitalize some of the expenditure behind the meter would simply allow us to expand the pie of types of projects that we can currently do without external funding support. That's really what we're trying to do, is just make these projects more cost effective so that we can do more of them at higher scale. There will be a scale at which it doesn't matter whether it's expense or capital dollars. The electrification project is going to be too expensive to offset it with the cost of a gas capital project. And then you will either be raising rates on gas customers by asking them to pay for it, or you will be seeking external funding to do the projects. Our preference, given the long-term rate trajectory we see, is clearly for it to be funded externally. We also don't think that it's generally fair to ask gas customers to pay for other people to do things which are going to disadvantage them in the long term, as they're going to be left on the system holding the cost of operating the system.
Magda?
Magda, TNDC, I have a question mostly for Veronika. As you are more advanced or most advanced right now with the electrification mandates and even the rehab that require electrification, what is the Half Moon Bay approach, or what help the city is offering to the historical buildings? I know this is especially difficult to deal with HVAC. Do you have any extra financial help or any other help available to historical building? Thanks.
Sure. So we don't have any requirements at this time, but we've had a lot of conversations with people who are doing remodel projects or appliance replacements that want to get a little bit more information and make a decision looking at the long term. And while the city can't necessarily at this point in time provide funding for those individual homeowners to do some of those upgrades, we have been helping them navigate kind of like all of the information that's out there. So the incentives, how to apply, we're pointing them to the switches on and that list of contractors that can potentially help them. Peninsula Clean Energy, RCCA, also has a program called All Electric Design that where every customer is entitled to about 20 hours of an expert's time to talk through their specific project. It's something that they provide, but I don't think a lot of people utilize. And I used it through when I was doing my electrification process. And it was really helpful to just have somebody to bounce those ideas off of. So I've connected a lot of people with that. But really, I've just had a lot of one-on-one conversations with people. I have a lot of people who call me who are like really angry about what the city did. And those opportunities to kind of like level with them, validate their concerns and talk through the process and really talk through what's available to them because it's changing every day. I've been actually able to help people kind of move to the other side and realize, hey, this actually is beneficial for me, not just because of this 2445 date, but just looking at everything I care about.
Do you have a question, Ivana?
Yes, a couple questions. Thank you, Veronika. A couple questions about the cleanliness of fuels. So there are a few questions coming in about whether electricity in California is cleaner than gas. So if we could just kind of cover that that territory. And then a similar question about propane. Are propane users really generating more GHG, more emissions than natural gas users? So elaborating a little bit on the cleanliness of both of these sources.
I can try that, but welcome others to add. Electricity in California in particular is extremely clean. PG&E last year was almost 90% decarbonized generation in our entire portfolio for the last year. There's a large amount of nuclear associated with that. Diablo Canyon, I think, was in the news. I figure people probably are aware of that. That's about 20% of the overall load. And then we have a huge amount of renewable solar and wind that's been brought on the system over the last decade. And PG&E has one of the largest hydroelectric networks in the world. So it's very, very clean. In addition, even in areas where electricity is less clean, it's my understanding that the efficiency of heat pumps is so high compared to gas appliances that you're still achieving quite a large amount of carbon reductions by electrifying, even in areas where electric generation is less clean than it is in California. To the second question about, sorry, there was a second half of the question. The propane one. So I'm not an expert in propane, but my understanding is just at the combustion point, propane does have a higher carbon intensity than natural gas. I believe that's available in a number of studies. I don't have them at my fingertips, but I think that's fairly well understood.
I could just add to that. So I think a reason there could be a little confusion is the carbon content of the fuel itself. And yet the propane is generally higher density than ambient air. And so does not rise in the atmosphere and contribute to global warming indirectly if not combusted. And that's often the primary source of the greenhouse warming from natural gas. Sorry, with that break, Ivana, do you have another question?
Oh, we have a lot of questions. This is a matter of picking which one. Let's see. There's a few questions about, this is for specifically for David, but I think other panelists could weigh in here too. What is PG&E doing to support customers and cities to electrify? Responsiveness for service upgrades are inconsistent or can be. So this person is asking about panel upgrades. What do we do basically when there's delays around panel upgrades?
So the question sounds like it's specifically about panel upgrades, which I can cover. I can also talk a little bit about the electric grid more broadly. So panel upgrades, typically PG&E doesn't get involved with unless it's through the context of one of our programs or direct incentive installs that we would make in a customer's home. But the panel in people's home is generally behind the meter, and that's their equipment, and PG&E doesn't necessarily get engaged in those upgrades. What, of course, we do get engaged in is the front of the meter upgrades to make sure the electric distribution system can handle any increase in load that a customer may bring on. That's an area where we've had some challenges over the last couple of years, especially as we've been really trying to reduce wildfire risk on our system. And so we've been deploying a lot of capital towards vegetation management, undergrounding, and system hardening. And that's created a dynamic where over the last few years, we've not been able to fund capacity deployment on our system to the extent that we would have liked to. We're really working hard currently on that. We think we've got a pathway, especially with all of the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act money that's available, that we can try to get external funding to do some of that capacity work on our system to accelerate deployment. This is largely being driven by electric vehicles because the loads are so large. We think buildings typically will be subsumed within the general capacity upgrades on the system we'll be doing for electric vehicles. So over time, we think those connection times should be declined, and we have a strategy in place to make sure that happens.
And I would add to that to the greatest extent possible, you may be able to avoid service panel upgrades. There are more and more technologies coming out every day that are what we call retrofit ready. They can be plugged into the wall. They don't have a significant impact on your existing service capacity. There are load management technologies that are being explored, and never forget the importance of energy efficiency as a part of any of these projects, because it's amazing how much an investment in energy efficiency can actually create some capacity on your panel as well. So I think that that's always the first place to look if you can.
That's a great point, Becky. We're seeing that in commercial and residential. Kellen, I see you have a question.
Yeah, hey, I'm Kellen Damon. I work with the County of Marin, and I coordinate our marketing and outreach for the sustainability team. So I have a question kind of around that. So I like the zonal approach with neighborhoods. I'm just wondering, since we have, experts in the room, might as well ask if you've seen any examples of jurisdiction kind of leading the charge on that, and how a jurisdictions need to coordinate with PG&E. Maybe Becky or David.
Beckie, you want to go first?
Sure, I can I can make a stab at that. I do have some firsthand experience with this at East Bay Community Energy. The city of Berkeley has been a real leader in trying to explore pathways for getting off of natural gas. And they spent a long time trying to identify a potential area within their city limits that would be a good candidate for a decommissioning project. It really does require a strong partnership with the utility. The gas assets that are underground are something that the utility really is in the best place to look at, know what can be replaced, know what might be an issue to do so. And I will also say that while the obligation to serve exists, it can be a real barrier. I know there was at least one project that the city had identified that was looking pretty strong, and there are a handful of customers who weren't interested for reasons that we could probably have a whole nother webinar on. I know we're going to hear today from some real leaders who are also exploring some of these projects, so I'll let them speak to that. But David, I know you have a regional perspective here and can probably add a lot to this.
So like I said, the projects we've done to date are fairly small scale, so we haven't really needed a tremendous amount of engagement with the local government on just those specific projects. As we 2040, 2045 sounds quite far away. It's 22 years from now, and these things take a very long time, and I did a quick back of the envelope. Even the 100 customers that we've done is less than 0.1% of the overall gas system that we've decommissioned. So if we are going to do this by 2045, we need to be moving very, very quickly. And I think the next few years doing pilots with local governments and really figuring out how to do this at scale is probably the most important thing from a building electrification standpoint we can be doing. But we do not have a tremendous amount of experience doing it. We're doing this CEC project, working with community-based organizations. We've done this collaboration tool with local governments, and we have had some projects that have resulted from that. But we need to be moving much quicker and doing it much larger scale if we're going to get where we want to